On a quiet morning in the Caribbean, the island of Martinique was already awake. In the port city of Saint-Pierre, merchants opened their shops, workers moved through narrow streets, and the sea reflected the light of a calm sky. To many, it felt like an ordinary day, but above the city, Mount Pelée stood in silence, hiding a danger that few truly understood. For weeks, the volcano had been sending warning signs. The earth trembled beneath the island. Ash began to fall from the mountain. Strange vapors rose into the air. People noticed, talked, and worried, but life continued. Saint-Pierre was rich, busy, and proud. It was known as the Paris of the Caribbean, a city of culture, trade, and confidence. That confidence would become its greatest weakness. Authorities did not act with the urgency the moment demanded. Some believed the threat was exaggerated, others hoped the unrest would fade. But Mount Pelée was not calming down. It was preparing something far more violent than anyone expected. Then came the morning of May 8, 1902. In a matter of moments, the volcano unleashed a deadly pyroclastic surge, a superheated cloud of gas, ash, and volcanic debris moving with terrifying force. It rushed down the slopes and struck Saint-Pierre before most people could understand what was happening. Heat, ash, and shockwaves swept through the city with devastating speed. What had been a thriving coastal town became a scene of ruin almost instantly. This was not only an eruption, it was a collapse of time, warning, and human judgment. And in the heart of the Caribbean, history changed forever. In the days and weeks before the disaster, Saint-Pierre lived inside a dangerous illusion. The city was prosperous, crowded, and confident. Ships came and went from the harbor. Markets were full. Churches rang their bells. Cafes and offices carried on with the rhythm of a place that believed itself secure. Yet the mountain above the city was already speaking in a language of smoke, tremors, and fire. Mount Pelée had been quiet for years, so quiet that many people had come to see it as little more than a scenic backdrop. But by late April of 1902, that calm had ended. Small earthquakes began to rattle the island. Faint ash drifted from the summit. On the slopes there were strange sounds, sulfurous fumes, and signs that the volcano was waking from a long sleep. To those who understood the language of volcanoes, the warnings were serious. To many others, they were easy to ignore. This was Saint-Pierre at its most vulnerable. It was a city with confidence but without preparation. It had no modern evacuation system. It had no clear public understanding of volcanic danger. And most tragically, it had leaders who failed to respond with the speed that the situation required. Some officials reassured the public. Others hesitated. The threat was discussed, but not truly confronted. As the pressure beneath the mountain continued to build, the warnings became harder to dismiss. Ash fell more heavily. The air became uneasy. The island felt increasingly trapped between fear and denial. Yet the daily life of the city continued, as if routine itself could protect it from catastrophe. On the 5th of May, the situation became more alarming. The volcano sent up stronger bursts of ash and steam. The sky darkened. The ground shook again. Still, evacuation remained incomplete. Many residents stayed because they believed they had time. Others stayed because they trusted official calm over natural warning. Some could not afford to leave. Others simply did not believe the danger would become immediate. That hesitation would prove fatal. Mount Pelée was not building toward a gentle release. It was moving toward a violent, explosive event, the kind that turns rock into ash, heat into a weapon, and gravity into destruction. What followed would not be a normal eruption with flowing lava and distant danger. It would be something far more sudden, far more lethal, and far more impossible to escape. The city was standing on borrowed time, though almost no one realized it. And above Saint-Pierre, the mountain continued to gather its force in silence. As the morning of May 8th approached, the island seemed to hold its breath. In Saint-Pierre, the light was bright, the harbor was calm, and everyday life had not yet fully surrendered to fear. But the mountain was no longer quiet. Mount Pelée was entering the final stage of its awakening, and the signs were becoming impossible to ignore. Witnesses had already seen ash rising from the summit. They had felt the earth tremble beneath their feet. They had watched the sky change, as if the island itself were being slowly erased by a force rising from below. In a place where the volcano had once seemed distant and passive, danger was now close enough to touch. By then, the atmosphere in Saint-Pierre had become uneasy. Some residents were frightened, others were confused, many still believed the worst would pass. There had been warnings, yes, but warnings are not the same as action. The city remained populated, active, and exposed. Its streets were still filled with people going about their lives, unaware that the most violent moment in its history was about to arrive. Then, in the early hours of the morning, the mountain finally broke open with catastrophic force. What came next was not a slow flow of lava creeping across the land. It was a pyroclastic surge, a fast-moving cloud of searing gas, ash, and volcanic fragments, driven downhill by unimaginable pressure. It was hot enough to destroy flesh, ignite wood, and shatter the normal limits of survival. It moved with astonishing speed, faster than panic could spread, faster than most people could run, faster than the city could understand what was happening to it. Saint-Pierre was struck almost instantly. The surge tore through buildings, collapsed roofs, shattered windows, and consumed entire blocks in a violent wave of heat and debris. The harbor became a place of chaos. Ships were caught in the blast. Streets turned into corridors of death. People who were outdoors had almost no chance. Those inside found that walls offered little protection against such overwhelming force. This was the true horror of Mount Pelée. It did not destroy like a typical mountain of fire. It erased. It arrived with such suddenness that the difference between life and death was measured not in hours, but in moments. Among the few who survived, the stories would later become part of volcanic history. But for the vast majority of Saint-Pierre, there was no escape, no warning in time, and no chance to understand what had hit them. In minutes, a living city became a graveyard of ash, flame, and silence. And from that silence came one of the most important lessons in the history of volcano science. Some disasters do not unfold slowly. They strike like a verdict. After the eruption, Saint-Pierre was no longer the city it had been only moments before. The streets that once carried merchants, students, workers, and families were buried under ash, shattered stone, and silence. Fires burned where homes had stood. The harbor, once filled with trade and movement, had become a scene of wreckage and confusion. In less than the span of a breath, the heart of the city had been torn out. The force of the disaster was so overwhelming that many of the dead never had a chance to react. The heat was instantaneous. The air itself became an enemy. Buildings collapsed, wooden structures ignited, and metal objects twisted under the violence of the surge. The destruction was not limited to one street or one neighborhood. It spread across the city with a brutal, sweeping finality. And yet, from this overwhelming tragedy emerged a handful of human stories that would later capture the world's attention. A very small number of survivors managed to escape death, each story marked by luck, timing, and unusual shelter. Some were protected by thick walls. Others were shielded by circumstances so extraordinary that they seemed almost impossible. Their survival only made the scale of the catastrophe more haunting because it proved that life and death had been separated by the thinnest of margins. One of the most famous survivors was a prisoner who endured the blast inside a reinforced cell. His survival became part of the legend of Mount Pelée, but it also revealed something important about the eruption itself. Protection was possible only in the rarest and most accidental of conditions. For nearly everyone else, the event had been immediate and unforgiving. Outside Saint-Pierre, the broader island also felt the consequences. Ash drifted across the landscape. Panic spread beyond the city. News traveled slowly at first, then with devastating clarity. When people began to understand the scale of what had happened, disbelief gave way to mourning. This was not a local incident. It was a catastrophe of historic proportions. The city's identity was gone. Saint-Pierre had once been proud, elegant, and prosperous. It had been known as the Paris of the Caribbean, a place of commerce, culture, and confidence. Now it stood as a symbol of fragility, a reminder that prosperity offers no shield against nature when warning is ignored. In the days that followed, rescuers and observers arrived to confront the aftermath. What they found was almost beyond comprehension. Ruins stretched across the city. Survivors were few. The dead were everywhere, and the scale of the damage forced scientists, officials, and the public to rethink what volcanoes could do. Mount Pelée had revealed a kind of destruction that was fast, extreme, and merciless, and from that moment forward, the world would never look at volcanic danger in quite the same way again. Mount Pelée did more than destroy a city. It changed the way the world understood volcanic danger. Before 1902, many people still imagined volcanoes as mountains that erupted in visible, almost understandable ways, sending lava slowly downhill and threatening only the land closest to the summit. Saint-Pierre shattered that illusion. It showed that a volcano could kill not by distance, but by speed, not by burning lava alone, but by a violent cloud of heat, gas, ash, and rock that moved with terrifying force. In the aftermath, scientists began to study what had happened with greater urgency. They needed to understand how such a deadly surge could form, why it moved so quickly, and why so few people had any chance of surviving it. The disaster helped define the modern understanding of pyroclastic flows and surges, especially the kind now associated with explosive volcanic domes and collapsed eruption columns. Mount Pelée became one of the most important case studies in the history of volcanology. But science was not the only lesson. There was also a human one. The tragedy exposed the cost of delay, denial, and overconfidence. Saint-Pierre had received warnings. The mountain had spoken in tremors and ash. Yet evacuation came too late, and public caution never matched the scale of the danger. In that gap between knowledge and action, thousands lost their lives. The city itself never fully returned to what it once was. Though parts of Saint-Pierre were eventually rebuilt, its former role and glory were gone. The city that had once stood as a proud center of Caribbean life became a memorial to disaster. Its streets, ruins, and preserved remains would later attract historians, geologists, and visitors who came not only to remember the dead, but to understand the lesson left behind. Meanwhile, Mount Pelée remained active, watched more carefully in the years that followed. The volcano was no longer seen as a silent backdrop. It had become a permanent reminder that landscapes can hide catastrophic power beneath familiar beauty. Around the world, other volcanic regions studied the event, taking note of the warning signs that had been missed in Martinique. Even today, the story carries an unsettling force because it speaks to something universal. A city can feel safe until the moment it is not. Civilization can seem stable until a natural force reminds us how fragile that stability really is. The people of Saint-Pierre were not living in a fictional warning tale. They were living in a real city on a real island, beneath a real volcano, at the edge of a disaster they could not stop. That is what makes Mount Pelée endure in history, not only because of the death toll or the speed of the destruction, but because it exposed a truth that remains relevant in every age. When nature warns us, hesitation can be fatal. In the end, the story of Mount Pelée is not only a story of destruction, it is a story of memory, responsibility, and the cost of ignoring danger until it becomes irreversible. More than a century later, the name Saint-Pierre still carries the weight of that morning in May, when a thriving city was erased in a matter of minutes. What remains is not just ruin, but testimony. The tragedy endures because it forced the world to face a hard truth. Human beings often trust what is familiar. They build lives around routines, markets, churches, harbors, and the comforting belief that tomorrow will resemble today. Saint-Pierre lived inside that belief until the moment it was proven false. Mount Pelée turned an ordinary morning into a historical rupture, and in doing so, it exposed the limits of pride, habit, and delay. Yet the disaster also gave birth to knowledge. Modern volcanology owes much to the lessons learned in Martinique. Scientists came to better understand explosive eruptions, deadly surges, and the importance of observing warning signs with seriousness. The eruption became a benchmark for studying how volcanoes can behave when pressure is released in the most violent way possible. From that moment on, the language of volcanic risk changed. For the people who died, that knowledge came too late. But for future generations, it became a form of protection. That is the strange and painful legacy of such catastrophes. They take lives, but they also force the world to learn. They leave behind loss, but they also leave warnings that may save others. In that sense, Saint-Pierre became more than a destroyed city. It became a lesson carved into history. Today, the mountain still stands over the island, no longer as a silent backdrop, but as a reminder. Visitors come to Martinique and see beauty, landscape, and history all in the same place. But beneath that beauty lies the memory of what happened when the earth opened and the city was not ready. The ruins, the stories, and the silence all speak for those who could not survive to tell it themselves. Mount Pelée remains one of the clearest examples of how quickly life can change when warning is ignored. It reminds us that disaster is not always slow, not always obvious, and not always merciful. Sometimes it arrives like thunder, like fire, like a sentence already decided. And that is why this story still matters. Because it is not only about the past, it is about every place where people live near danger and choose whether to listen. It is about the fragile distance between normal life and irreversible loss. And it is about the mountain that in one terrible morning taught the world how fast a city can disappear.